Every crime is a wound on the world. We're here to dissect it, layer by layer, to find the truth buried within. This is Anatomy of Crime. It is a perfect day for a race, April 15, 2013, Patriots' Day in Boston. The air is crisp, still carrying the last hints of a New England winter, but the sun is bright, promising the arrival of a long-awaited spring. Along the 26.2-mile ribbon of road stretching from Hopkinton to Boston, the atmosphere is electric, a symphony of civic pride and human endurance. It is a secular holiday, a pilgrimage for runners, and a festival for spectators. Families have staked out their spots for hours, armed with coolers and handmade signs bearing names like "Go Dead Go." College students, freed from classes, line the streets of Brookline, their cheers a roaring wave of energy that pushes exhausted runners toward the finish line. The Boston Marathon is not just a sporting event, it is the city's heart, beating out a rhythm of resilience and community. In Copley Square, near the iconic blue and yellow finish line on Boylston Street, the crowds are at their thickest, a joyous crush of humanity pressed against metal barricades. The scene is framed by historic landmarks. The grand Romanesque facade of the Boston Public Library on one side, the Gothic Revival stonework of the Old South Church on the other. The first waves of elite runners have already crossed, their ordeal over. Now, the great river of humanity follows. The charity runners, the amateur athletes, the ones running in memory of a loved one, each with a story etched on their face. The sound is a joyful cacophony, cowbells, applause, shouts of encouragement, the triumphant announcement of names as runners complete their epic journey. At 2:49 in the afternoon, the city's heart skips a beat, and then another. Two blasts, just 13 seconds apart. The sound is utterly alien, a deafening percussive crack that rips through the celebratory noise, instantly replacing it with something primal and terrifying. It is a low, guttural boom that feels less heard and more felt, a concussion that travels through the pavement into the soles of your feet. A plume of thick, white-gray smoke billows upward from the sidewalk near the Marathon Sports Store, obscuring the afternoon sun. The cheering evaporates, replaced by a collective gasp, then screams of panic and pain. The festive banners, the brightly colored jackets, the finish line itself, all are suddenly cast in the grim tableau of a war zone. The air, moments before filled with the scent of popcorn and spring, is now acrid with the smell of sulfur and burnt metal. What was a scene of triumph becomes a landscape of chaos and carnage. Twisted metal barricades, shattered glass, and abandoned belongings litter the street. The ground is slit with blood. In those first disorienting seconds, no one understands what has happened. An accident, a transformer explosion, but the second blast, further down the block near the Forum restaurant, confirms the horrifying truth. This was not an accident. This was an attack. This was a deliberate act of violence, aimed at the heart of the city on its proudest day, executed with weapons of calculated cruelty. Pressure cookers, packed with nails, ball bearings, and carpenter's tacks, designed not merely to kill, but to maim, to shred human flesh, to terrorize. In the immediate aftermath, as first responders run toward the smoke and chaos, another quieter process begins. Unseen, unheard, and unnoticed by the panicked crowds, millions of digital eyes remain open. The security camera mounted above the doorway of the Lord & Taylor department store continues its silent, dispassionate recording. The lens of a news camera, perched on a balcony overlooking the finish line, captures the unfolding horror in high definition. In the pockets and purses of thousands of spectators, smartphones that had been recording a loved one's triumphant finish are now inadvertently documenting the crime scene of the century. Every device, every lens, every pixel becomes a potential witness. The perpetrators, two young men who had moments before moved invisibly through the crowd, believe they have melted back into the city, anonymous and untraceable. They are wrong. They have not just left behind pressure cooker bombs. They have left behind a trail of digital breadcrumbs, a ghostly image of themselves, captured from 100 different angles. They have become ghosts in the machine, and in the hours and days that followed, the city of Boston, and indeed the entire American law enforcement apparatus, would embark on an unprecedented hunt for these ghosts, a manhunt that would stand in stark contrast to the investigations of the past. The search for the Unabomber took 17 years of painstaking forensic analysis of physical letters. The hunt for the Atlanta Olympics bomber, Eric Rudolph, was a 5-year slog through the Appalachian wilderness. The Boston investigation would be a 102-hour digital sprint. Today, on Anatomy of Crime, we dissect the anatomy of a digital manhunt. We will explore how, in the chaotic hours and days after the attack, investigators built a dragnet, not of roadblocks and patrol cars, but of pixels, data packets, and algorithms, pioneering a new era of criminal investigation and forever changing the relationship between surveillance, privacy, and public safety. The first hour after the explosions was a study in controlled chaos. As Boston's emergency medical services performed battlefield triage on the bloody sidewalks of Boylston Street, law enforcement began the monumental task of securing the largest and most complex crime scene in the city's history. The Federal Bureau of Investigation, through its Boston-based Joint Terrorism Task Force, or JTTF, immediately took the lead, a standard protocol for any suspected act of terrorism on American soil. Special agent in charge of the Boston field office, Richard Delorier, a veteran investigator, became the public face of the investigation. The crime scene itself was enormous, spanning 15 blocks that were immediately cordoned off with miles of yellow tape. It was a forensic nightmare. Every single piece of debris was a potential clue, and it was all intermingled with the personal belongings of thousands of people who had fled in terror. Investigators from the FBI, the ATF, the Boston Police Department, and the Massachusetts State Police in hazmat suits would spend days on their hands and knees, painstakingly collecting evidence, fragments of the Fagor pressure cookers, pieces of a circuit board from a toy car used as a detonator, remnants of a black nylon backpack, and the cruel, indiscriminate shrapnel designed to inflict maximum damage. But even as this traditional forensic work began, Delorier and his team knew that the most critical evidence was not necessarily on the ground. It was in the cloud. It was stored on hard drives, on memory cards, on servers scattered across the city and around the world. At his first press conference, flanked by city and state officials, Delorier made a direct and urgent plea to the public. He asked for anyone who had photos or videos taken near the finish line in the hours leading up to the attack to come forward. Your information, he said with grim understatement, will be critical. It was a standard request in the early stages of a major investigation, but no one, not even the FBI, could have anticipated the response. It was not a trickle of information. It was a deluge, a digital tidal wave that threatened to overwhelm the very infrastructure set up to receive it. The FBI immediately established a dedicated website portal and a toll-free tip line. Within hours, they were inundated. The public submitted more than 10,000 videos and over 120,000 photographs. This was in addition to the terabytes of data being collected from fixed sources. the high-resolution surveillance systems of businesses like Lord & Taylor and the Forum restaurant, which stood directly adjacent to the two blast sites, ATM cameras, city-owned traffic cameras, and the dashboard cameras from the dozens of police cruisers, fire trucks, and ambulances that had rushed to the scene. The sheer volume was staggering, equivalent to several libraries of Congress worth of raw data. It was unlike anything an investigative body had ever faced. To handle this unprecedented challenge, the FBI transformed a cavernous space at the Black Falcon terminal in South Boston into a high-tech command center. They brought in hundreds of digital forensic experts, analysts, and agents from across the country, and utilized powerful software designed to sort and process massive amounts of visual information. The first step was to create a comprehensive timeline and a three-dimensional digital model of the crime scene. Analysts working around the clock synchronized the timestamps from hundreds of different video sources, a Herculean task given that few cameras are perfectly synced. This allowed them to create a single, continuous, multi-angled view of Boylston Street in the hours before the bombing. They then drew a virtual perimeter, a digital fence, around the two blast sites. The working theory was simple, almost elegant in its logic. The bombs were heavy, contained in backpacks. Therefore, the perpetrators had to have carried them to the exact locations where they detonated. The mission was to find the person or people who walked into that virtual perimeter with a backpack and left without one. It was a search for a needle in a haystack composed of countless terabytes of data. Investigators began the painstaking, eyes-training work of watching, frame by frame, the final minutes leading up to 2:49 p.m. They used video analytics software like BriefCam, which allows an analyst to view hours of footage in minutes by showing only moving objects. But the final confirmation always came down to a human eye. They tracked hundreds of individuals carrying backpacks, meticulously following their paths through the dense crowd, ruling them out one by one as they moved away from the blast zones or were seen with their bags after the explosion. While the FBI was methodically building its digital case inside the secure confines of the Black Falcon terminal, the world was introduced to the two young men who had shattered the peace of Patriots' Day, Tamerlan and Jahar Tsarnaev. To understand their path to Boylston Street, you have to trace their family's journey, a story of displacement and disillusionment that began halfway around the world. The Tsarnaevs were ethnically Chechen, a people with a long and bloody history of conflict with Russia. The family had been displaced by the brutal wars in Chechnya and spent time in the volatile Republic of Dagestan and the Central Asian nation of Kyrgyzstan before arriving in the United States as political refugees in 2002. They settled in Cambridge, Massachusetts, a city known for its elite universities and progressive culture, a world away from the war-torn Caucasus. The father, Anzor, was a mechanic. The mother, Zubaydat, worked in a beauty salon. They had 4 children, 2 daughters, Bella and Ilona, and 2 sons, Tamerlan and Jahar. Tamerlan, the elder son, was 15 years old when he arrived. He was intense, charismatic, and driven. He found an outlet for his aggression in boxing, and for a time he showed real promise. He was a handsome, athletic young man who won the New England Golden Gloves heavyweight title twice. He dreamed of boxing for the U.S. Olympic team, but a change in eligibility rules for non-citizens barred his way. He enrolled at Bunker Hill Community College, but dropped out. His life seemed to be adrift. He married an American woman, Catherine Russell, and had a daughter, but he struggled to hold down a steady job. It was during this period of personal and professional frustration that Tamerlan began to gravitate towards a more radical, fundamentalist interpretation of Islam. He started visiting extremist websites, consuming jihadist propaganda from figures like Anwar al-Awlaki, and voicing conspiracy theories about the American government being controlled by Jews. In 2011, this behavior was concerning enough that Russian intelligence, the FSB, sent a formal warning to the FBI, claiming that Tamerlan was an adherent of radical Islam and was preparing to travel overseas to connect with underground groups. The FBI conducted a preliminary investigation, including an interview with Tamerlan, but ultimately closed the case, finding no links to terrorism. It was a fateful assessment. The following year, Tamerlan took a 6-month trip to Dagestan and Chechnya. During this trip, he is believed to have connected with militants, including a Canadian jihadist named William Plotnikov, who was later killed by Russian forces. When Tamerlan returned to Cambridge, he was changed. More devout and more vocal in his extremist beliefs, he was no longer the aspiring American Olympian. He was a man nursing a deep and dangerous grievance. Jahar, known to his friends as Jahar, was a different story. He was only 8 when he came to America and seemed to assimilate far more easily than his older brother. He was a popular student at the prestigious Cambridge Rindge and Latin School, a classmate of the future actor Patrick Ewing, Jr. He was captain of the wrestling team, a good student, and known for his easygoing, friendly demeanor. Friends described him as a typical American teenager who enjoyed parties, music, and social media. In 2012, he enrolled at the University of Massachusetts Dartmouth and became a naturalized U.S. citizen on September 11th of that year, a date of chilling irony. But beneath the surface there were signs of trouble. His grades began to slip, and he was reportedly dealing marijuana to make money. He lived a life of dualities, straddling the world of a normal college kid and the increasingly radicalized world of his older brother, whom he idolized. His Twitter account, @J_Czar, was a revealing portrait of this split personality. One moment he would post about girls or television shows. The next, a cryptic message like, "I'm a stress-free kind of guy." Days after the bombing, before his identity was known, he tweeted, "Ain't no love in the heart of the city. Stay safe, people." It was a powerful and ultimately fatal influence from Tamerlan. Investigators believe Tamerlan was the driving force behind the plot, the ideologue who convinced his younger, more impressionable brother to join his holy war. Together, using instructions from an online Al-Qaeda magazine called Inspire, they learned how to build their weapons of terror from ordinary household items. They were a self-contained, self-radicalized terror cell of 2, operating completely off the radar of law enforcement. Back at the FBI's command center, the digital dragnet was closing in. After nearly 2 full days of relentless, round-the-clock analysis, the investigators had their breakthrough. It wasn't one single eureka moment, but a series of connections made by different analysts looking at different streams of footage. The first critical video was from a security camera on the roof of the Forum restaurant, located at 755 Boylston Street. The footage showed a young man in a white baseball cap, later identified as Jahar Tsarnaev, walking with the crowd. He slips his backpack off his shoulders and places it on the ground by a metal barricade, right at the feet of the Martin family. He lingers for a moment, looking around, even appearing to make a brief phone call. Then he casually walks away. 4 minutes later, the bomb inside that backpack detonates, killing 8-year-old Martin Richard and grievously injuring his mother and sister. The second crucial piece of evidence came from the high-resolution cameras outside the Lord and Taylor department store, further down the street. This footage, from a higher angle and with greater clarity, captured both brothers walking together minutes before the attack. Tamerlan, labeled Suspect 1, in a black baseball cap and sunglasses, and Jahar, Suspect 2, behind him in the white cap. The clarity of this footage was the money shot. It provided investigators with clear, usable images of their faces, enough for facial recognition software to make potential matches against government databases, and more importantly, enough for a member of the public to make a positive identification. By Wednesday evening, April 17th, less than 50 hours after the attack, the FBI had positively identified their two primary suspects. They knew what they looked like, they had tracked their movements to the points of detonation, and they had seen them walk away without their deadly cargo. Now came a critical decision: what to do with this information. The debate within the investigative team was intense. Releasing the images to the public could be a massive asset. A city of millions would become their eyes and ears, and someone, somewhere, was bound to recognize the men. But it was also fraught with risk. Releasing the photos would alert the suspects that they had been identified. It would ignite a fire under them, potentially causing them to flee, to destroy evidence, or worse, to strike again in a desperate final act. There was also the significant danger of false leads and misidentifications flooding their already overwhelmed system. The leadership of the JTTF weighed the options. For nearly a day, they held back, continuing to build their case privately, hoping to identify and locate the suspects before they knew they were being watched. But the pressure to act was immense. The city was on edge, gripped by fear and a desperate need for answers. On the afternoon of Thursday, April 18th, Richard Delorier walked to the podium once more. He announced that the FBI was seeking the public's help in identifying two suspects, and then the images were released to the world. The moment the photos hit the internet and television screens, the investigation transformed. The carefully controlled professional manhunt orchestrated by the FBI was suddenly joined by a chaotic amateur and global one. The internet erupted. On platforms like Reddit and 4chan, self-proclaimed digital sleuths began their own investigations. They created subreddits like r/Find Boston Bombers and began a frenzied, crowdsourced analysis of every available photo of the marathon crowd. Users downloaded high-resolution images, zoomed in, circled faces, drew lines and arrows, and posted their theories with an air of certainty. It was a fascinating and terrifying demonstration of the hive mind at work. In one sense, it showcased the incredible potential of distributed intelligence. Thousands of pairs of eyes were scanning for details the FBI might have missed, but it quickly devolved into a digital witch hunt. The anonymous and unaccountable nature of these forums led to rampant speculation and reckless accusations, creating a dangerous feedback loop as mainstream media outlets began to report on the social media buzz, lending it an unearned veneer of credibility. The most prominent and tragic victim of this online mob was Sunil Tripathi, a Brown University student who had been missing for a month. Amateur sleuths, noticing a perceived resemblance between Tripathi and one of the suspects in the grainy photos, began to build a case against him. The fact that he was already a missing person fit their narrative that a suspect might have gone into hiding. His name began trending on Twitter. Journalists, chasing the story, started calling his family, who were already enduring the agony of a missing loved one, now forced to deny that their son was a mass murderer. For a few terrifying hours, the world was convinced that a missing and likely vulnerable young man was a terrorist. It was a brutal, baseless accusation born of digital groupthink. The body of Sunil Tripathi was later found in the Providence River. He had taken his own life, an act entirely unrelated to the Boston bombing. His case became a powerful cautionary tale about the dark side of crowdsourcing justice. The public's desire to help was understandable, but without the discipline, training, and ethical framework of professional investigators, it proved to be a dangerous and destructive force. The digital manhunt had become a double-edged sword, capable of both illuminating the truth and casting suspicion on the innocent. For the Tsarnaev brothers, hiding in their Cambridge apartment, the release of their images was a death knell. They knew they had been seen. Their anonymity was gone. Their time was up. That evening, they made their move, triggering a chain of events that would plunge the city into a new level of terror. Their first act was one of cold-blooded murder. At approximately 10:30 p.m. on the campus of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, they ambushed MIT police officer Sean Collier as he sat in his patrol car. Collier was a dedicated officer, just 27 years old, and on the cusp of achieving his dream of joining the Somerville Police Department. The brothers shot him multiple times at close range in a failed attempt to steal his firearm, a sign they were planning for a further confrontation. From MIT, they fled into the night, desperate for a getaway vehicle. A short time later, they carjacked a black Mercedes SUV, taking its owner, a 26-year-old Chinese entrepreneur named Dun Meng, hostage. What happened over the next 90 minutes was a harrowing ordeal for Meng and a critical turning point for the investigation. With Tamerlan driving and Jahar in the passenger seat, they forced Meng to drive through the darkened streets of Cambridge, Brighton, and Watertown. During the drive, Tamerlan, brazen and arrogant, openly confessed to his captive. "Did you hear about the Boston explosion?" he asked. "I did that." He spoke of the Collier murder and his intention to drive to New York City to set off more bombs in Times Square. As they drove, they needed gas and cash, forcing Meng to withdraw money from an ATM. They pulled into a Shell gas station on Memorial Drive in Cambridge. While Jahar went inside to pay, Tamerlan was distracted, fiddling with a GPS device. In that split second of opportunity, Dun Meng made a decision that would save his own life and change the course of the manhunt. He performed a mental checklist. Door unlocked, seatbelt unbuckled. He counted to himself, then executed what he later called the most important move of his life. He threw open his door and bolted. He sprinted across the street to a mobile gas station and frantically told the attendant to call 911. The Tsarnaev brothers, stunned, sped away, but they had made a fatal mistake. In their haste, they had left Dun Meng's smartphone in the car. When police arrived, Meng told them about the phone and its Find My iPhone feature. For law enforcement, it was the digital key they desperately needed. The hunt for ethereal, pixelated ghosts had suddenly become a real-time, physical pursuit. His analog bravery had enabled the next phase of the digital chase. Using the GPS signal from the phone, police were able to track the stolen Mercedes as it moved into the residential neighborhood of Watertown. A single Watertown police officer, Joseph Reynolds, spotted the SUV and began to follow it. He was soon joined by Sergeant John McClellan. On the quiet, tree-lined block of Laurel Street, the Mercedes and a second car, a Honda Civic the brothers were also using, came to a sudden stop. The brothers got out, and the night exploded in gunfire. What followed was one of the most intense and violent shootouts in modern American law enforcement history. The quiet suburban street became a war zone. The Tsarnaev brothers were armed with a Ruger P95 handgun, and they had more bombs. They threw multiple improvised explosive devices at the officers, including another pressure cooker bomb, which detonated with terrifying force, sending a shockwave through the entire neighborhood and riddling a police cruiser with shrapnel. Officers from multiple departments, Watertown, Cambridge, Boston, the state police, rushed to the scene, exchanging hundreds of rounds of gunfire. During the firefight, MBTA Transit Police Officer Dick Donahue was shot in the leg, severing his femoral artery. He collapsed, bleeding profusely, and would survive only through the heroic efforts of his fellow officers who administered life-saving aid on the scene. Amid the chaos, Tamerlan Tsarnaev, his handgun apparently jammed or out of ammunition, charged directly at the officers. He was tackled and taken to the ground. As officers struggled to handcuff him, Jahar, who had gotten back into the stolen Mercedes, hit the gas and drove directly at the pile of officers. They scattered just in time. Jahar ran over his own brother, dragging him a short distance down the street before abandoning the car and escaping on foot into the darkness. Tamerlan Tsarnaev, riddled with bullets and suffering massive blunt force trauma, was rushed to Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center, the same hospital where doctors were still treating his victims. One suspect was down. The other, wounded and desperate, was loose somewhere in Watertown. The escape of Jahar Tsarnaev triggered an unprecedented response. As dawn broke on Friday, Governor Deval Patrick announced a shelter-in-place order for the entire city of Boston, as well as the surrounding communities of Watertown, Cambridge, Newton, Belmont, and Waltham. The bustling metropolis of over 1 million people came to a complete standstill. The subway system, the T, was shut down. Buses stopped running. Businesses were ordered to remain closed. Residents were told to lock their doors and stay away from their windows. The city that had been the scene of a vibrant marathon just 4 days earlier now looked like a ghost town. The streets were eerily silent, patrolled by armored vehicles and SWAT teams. Thousands of law enforcement officers, a veritable army of local, state, and federal agents, descended on Watertown. They conducted a massive door-to-door search, clearing houses block by block. It was a methodical, exhausting, and for many hours fruitless search. Helicopters with thermal imaging cameras crisscrossed the sky, looking for any sign of a heat signature in backyards or sheds. Online, the city was anything but quiet, as citizens listened to police scanners and followed journalists on Twitter, creating a second virtual theater for the drama unfolding. As the day wore on and the search yielded nothing, a sense of frustration began to set in. By early evening, with no sign of the suspect, officials made the decision to lift the shelter-in-place order. They conceded that Jahar may have slipped through their massive cordon. Residents, cooped up all day, began to cautiously emerge from their homes. In Watertown, on Franklin Street, a man named David Henberry, frustrated that the day-long lockdown had ended without a capture, decided to step outside for some fresh air and to check on his boat, the Slipaway 2, which was shrink-wrapped and dry-docked in his backyard. He immediately noticed that something was wrong. One of the straps holding the boat's cover, which he had secured tightly for the winter, was cut. He cautiously approached, put a small ladder against the hull, lifted the tarp and looked inside. He saw a pool of blood. Then he saw a body, the body of a young man, huddled inside the boat. Henberry retreated back into his house and immediately called 911. The manhunt was back on. Within minutes, Franklin Street was swarming with law enforcement. A Massachusetts State Police helicopter moved into position overhead, using its forward-looking infrared, or FLIR camera, to confirm the presence of a human body inside the boat. The thermal image was unmistakable. There was a heat signature, alive and moving, pushing up against the boat's hull. The digital hunt had once again found its physical target. Police established a tight perimeter and began a tense, hour-long standoff. They used a robot with a manipulator arm to pull back the boat's tarp, confirming it was indeed Dzhokhar Tsarnaev without endangering officers. He was weakened from blood loss but still considered extremely dangerous. After negotiators failed to convince him to surrender, flashbang grenades were thrown to disorient him. Finally, wounded and exhausted, Dzhokhar Tsarnaev emerged from the boat, his hands in the air. He was taken into custody at 8:42 p.m. on Friday, April 19th. A wave of spontaneous celebrations erupted across Boston. The long, terrifying ordeal was finally over. Inside the boat where he had been hiding, investigators would later find a note he had scrawled in pencil on the walls. It was a rambling justification for his actions. "The U.S. government is killing our innocent civilians," he wrote. "I can't stand to see such evil go unpunished. We Muslims are one body. You hurt one, you hurt us all." The capture of Dzhokhar Tsarnaev marked the end of the manhunt, but the beginning of a long legal process. He was charged in federal court with 30 counts, including use of a weapon of mass destruction resulting in death. His trial began in January 2015. The prosecution presented a mountain of evidence, much of it digital, that had led to his identification and capture. They played the surveillance videos for the jury, showing Dzhokhar placing the bomb behind the Richard family. The defense, led by renowned anti-death penalty lawyer Judy Clark, pursued a strategy of concession. They admitted Dzhokhar's involvement from the outset, but argued that he was a pawn, an impressionable young man who had fallen under the complete and total influence of his radicalized, domineering older brother. They portrayed Tamerlan as the mastermind and Dzhokhar as a reluctant accomplice. The strategy was not aimed at acquittal, but at saving their client's life. The prosecution effectively countered this narrative, using Dzhokhar's own words from his social media and the boat manifesto to portray him as a committed and unrepentant terrorist who acted of his own free will. On April 8, 2015, the jury found Dzhokhar Tsarnaev guilty on all 30 counts. On May 15th, they formally sentenced him to death. In the end, what is the ultimate anatomy of this case? The Boston Marathon bombing investigation represents a seminal moment in the history of law enforcement. It was the first major domestic terror investigation to unfold in the age of ubiquitous social media and mass surveillance. It created the modern playbook for a digitally driven manhunt. The case demonstrated the incredible power of fusing traditional police work with massive-scale data analysis and public crowdsourcing. The ability to collect, process, and analyze terabytes of video data from thousands of disparate sources in a matter of hours was a quantum leap in investigative capability. This was the system working exactly as designed, a model of interagency cooperation and technological integration. But the investigation also exposed the profound dangers and ethical complexities of this new reality. The online witch hunt for Sunil Tripathi revealed the dark underbelly of digital vigilantism, a world where suspicion becomes conviction in the blink of an eye. The lockdown of an entire American city, while successful, raised uncomfortable questions about the balance between security and civil liberties. The case forced a conversation about the nature of privacy in a world where every citizen with a smartphone is a potential surveillance camera, and every public square is under the constant gaze of 1,000 lenses. The manhunt for the Tsarnaev brothers proved that in the 21st century, it is nearly impossible to commit a major crime in a public space and remain a ghost. The digital breadcrumbs are always there, waiting for someone to follow the trail. The legacy of the Boston bombing is one of pain and resilience, of a city that refused to be terrorized. But its investigative legacy is more complex. It pulled back the curtain on the new architecture of security, one built on a foundation of data. It showed us that the same technologies that connect us and empower us can be turned into the most powerful dragnet ever conceived. The Tsarnaev brothers believed they could strike a blow against a nation and then simply melt away, disappearing back into the anonymity of the crowd. They failed to understand that the crowd itself was no longer anonymous. It was a network, a living, breathing sensor grid. In the end, the Tsarnaev brothers were not caught by a single brilliant detective or a lucky break. They were captured by the ghost in the machine, a city that, in its moment of greatest trauma, turned its countless digital eyes back on its attackers and refused to let them disappear. This has been Anatomy of Crime, where the truth is never simple, but always worth seeking.